The dawn that broke over Weatherfield on Tuesday, May 19, 2026, was a fractured, sharp sliver of pale gold that struggled to pierce the thick, smoke-colored fog rising from the Manchester Ship Canal. The damp, heavy air clung tenaciously to the red brick facades of Coronation Street, preserving the profound chill of a neighborhood that had spent the last 48 hours hovering on the precipice of absolute structural collapse. Sunday night's shocking revelation, the chilling realization that the anonymous digital architect known as Archangel was running the terrifying extortion ring from the dark, abandoned builder's yard at the edge of Victoria Street, had transformed the cobbles into a psychological minefield. The residents no longer walked past each other with the easy, casual familiarity of lifelong neighbors. Instead, every glance exchanged across the street was heavy with a toxic, corrosive suspicion. The faceless monster that had driven Theo Silverton to his grave systematically framed Summer Spellman and held the entire community in a vice grip of encrypted terror wasn't a distant corporate shadow. It was someone who shared their oxygen, someone who bought their milk from the corner shop, someone who had stood right beside them while pretending to share their collective grief. Inside the claustrophobic confines of Number 5, the atmospheric pressure had reached a suffocating peak as Billy Mayhew and Paul Foreman prepared for what felt like the most critical morning of their lives. The living room was entirely illuminated by the harsh, unyielding screen of a laptop computer resting on the coffee table, where a live diagnostic feed from DC Kit Green's cyberforensics terminal flickered with green and amber strings of raw code. Billy stood by the window, his fingers tightly hooked into the fabric of his dark vest, his clerical collar lying discarded on the sideboard like a piece of armor from a war he was no longer qualified to fight. His face was a deeply etched map of parental devastation and exhaustion, his eyes tracking the occasional pedestrian walking past the window with a sudden, hypervigilant panic. Paul sat rigidly in his armchair, his voice dropping into a low, jagged rasp that vibrated with months of pent-up rage as he stared at the screen, demanding to know why the police were still holding back from making an arrest when the digital coordinates pointed directly to their own doorstep. Billy turned slowly away from the glass, his voice remarkably quiet but laced with an immense, heartbreaking weight as he reminded Paul that a premature move by the authorities would allow Archangel to trigger a remote wipe sequence, permanently deleting the encrypted database that held the only definitive proof of Summer's innocence. The internal agony of the two men was a palpable, breathing entity in the room. They were being forced to play a high-stakes psychological game of chess with a ghost, knowing that a single miscalculated outburst could condemn their adoptive daughter to a decade behind a steel door for a murder she had tried desperately to prevent. The long-form narrative then transitioned out onto the wet cobblestones, tracking the immediate, agonizing fallout across the threshold of the Alahan household, where the generational shift from innocence to acute digital vulnerability had reached a definitive point of no return. Aadi Alahan stood by the kitchen counter, his jacket zipped tightly to his chin, and his fingers nervously rolling the edge of a printout sheet containing the decoded IP address he had painstakingly extracted from Summer's hidden pinprick code. His father, Dev, was pacing the narrow space between the dining table and the hallway door, his usual boisterous, larger-than-life energy entirely compressed into a tight knot of absolute terror. Dev's voice shook with a rare, raw vulnerability as he begged his son to step back from the front line of the investigation, pointing out that the people behind the Weatherfield Web had already proven they were willing to kill to protect their network. Aadi Alahan sat at the table, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as she watched her twin brother, her eyes filled with tears as she echoed her father's fears, reminding Aadi that if Archangel realized a university student had cracked their core encryption cipher, the next target wouldn't be a digital server, but the Alahan family itself. Aadi, however, stood his ground with a fierce, unyielding stubbornness that mirrored the finest traditions of the street's resilience, arguing with a quiet intensity that Summer had trusted him with her survival, and that hiding in the back of the shop, while she sat on a concrete bench at the precinct, would be a moral cowardice that would rot his soul faster than any virus the web could deploy. Meanwhile, inside the warm, amber sanctuary of the Rover's return, the Tuesday morning preparation was unfolding in a heavy, almost reverent silence that felt entirely foreign to the historic pub. Daisy Midgeley was mechanically wiping down the mahogany bar with a damp cloth, her eyes fixed entirely on the gantry mirrors, tracking the nervous, erratic movements of Ryan Connor as he organized the empty spirit bottles in the back room. The sickening suspicion that had taken root in Daisy's mind during Sunday night's lockup had grown into a towering, terrifying certainty. Every time Ryan checked his phone or flinched at the sound of the ice machine, Daisy felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She watched the way his shoulders twitched, the way he avoided eye contact when she asked a mundane question about the weekend delivery schedule, his voice coming out in a sharp, defensive snap that betrayed a mind completely consumed by hidden panic. The dramatic irony hanging over the bar was excruciatingly sharp. Daisy knew that the digital forensics team had traced Archangel's active transmissions to a radius that included the pub's perimeter, and as she watched Ryan's trembling hands almost drop a crate of tonic water, she was forced to confront the agonizing possibility that the person who had brought a dark, modern malice into their lives was someone she considered family. She stepped closer to the hatch, her voice dripping with a calculated, terrifyingly calm nonchalance as she casually mentioned that she had seen DC Kit Green inspecting the old builder's yard earlier that morning, her eyes locking onto Ryan's reflection to witness the exact second the color drained from his face and his posture locked into a rigid posture of pure, unadulterated guilt. The scene then shifted away from the domestic suspicions of the cobbles to the clinical, high-stakes environment of Interview Room 1 at the Weatherfield police station, where the psychological interrogation of Summer Spellman had entered a darker, more exhausting phase. The room was hot, the air static and smelling faintly of industrial disinfectant and stale coffee, with a steady, rhythmic hum of the digital audio recorder providing a relentless countdown to her fate. DS Lisa Swain sat directly across from the young woman, her expression completely stripped of its usual professional detachment, replaced instead by a cold, sharp intensity that signaled the arrival of the final, defining questions. Swain laid a series of high-resolution surveillance photographs on the table, images captured by a traffic camera on Victoria Street at 21:15 on the night of Theo Silverton's murder. The photographs showed a blurred silhouette exiting the rear of the Alahan property, carrying an item that looked identical to the secondary mobile device the police had recovered from Summer's bedroom. Swain leaned forward, her voice dropping into a firm, maternal but uncompromising register as she demanded to know why Summer was continuing to protect the identity of the person who had handed her that device, pointing out that the digital footprint proved she was being used as a human shield by someone she trusted. Summer looked down at the photographs, her cracked lips trembling as fresh tears cut clean tracks through the dust on her pale cheeks, her mind trapped in a terrifying loop. She knew that if she spoke the name out loud, the invisible administrators of the web would release the secondary archive that would utterly destroy Billy's reputation and Paul's remaining peace, leaving her caught in a tragic paradox where her silence was her only weapon but also her definitive conviction. The first chapter of this explosive episode reached its dramatic crescendo as the clock on the station walls struck 10:30 and DC Kit Green suddenly entered the interview room without knocking, his face grim and holding a fresh, red-stamped warrant file in his hand. He didn't look at Summer. Instead, he leaned down and whispered a sequence of verified server addresses into Swain's ear, causing the veteran detective's eyebrows to lock together in sudden, shocking comprehension. The digital dragnet had finally closed its teeth. The localized sweep based on Aadi's decoded IP address had just gone live, and the cybercrime unit had intercepted a massive, outbound data transfer originating from a terminal hidden inside the old builder's yard, a transfer that was actively attempting to scrub the entire infrastructure of the Weatherfield Web from the local network. As Swain stood up from her chair with a sharp, decisive movement that caused the metal legs to scrape violently against the linoleum floor, the narrative cut back to Coronation Street, where a massive, unannounced convoy of plainclothes police vehicles suddenly swerved around the corner of Victoria Street, their tires screeching against the damp tarmac as they blocked the entrance to the yard. The neighborhood stood completely frozen in time. Ken Barlow stepped out onto his doorstep, his hand shading his eyes against the pale morning light, while Roy Cropper watched from the window of the cafe, his hand holding a white tea towel suspended in midair as the community held its collective breath, realizing that the faceless monster was about to be pulled out into the light of day. The second chapter of this high-stakes Tuesday installment commenced at precisely 10:45, with a handheld camera plunging directly into the heart of the police raid at the abandoned builder's yard. The air inside the sprawling, derelict warehouse was thick with dust and the smell of damp timber, violently disturbed by the sudden influx of heavily armed tactical officers. DS Lisa Swain and DC Kit Green moved in tandem, their flashlights cutting sharp beams through the gloom as they breached a false plywood wall at the back of the foreman's old office. Inside this hidden alcove sat the nerve center of the Weatherfield Web. A bank of cooling fans hummed loudly, illuminating a makeshift desk cluttered with external hard drives, high-gain router arrays, and a triple-monitor workstation. The central screen was flashing with an amber, data deletion in progress warning bar, which had reached 84%. Kit Green immediately bypassed the main console, physically ripping the primary network cables from the wall socket to halt the remote wipe sequence, securing the digital evidence that would either permanently break the syndicate or condemn everyone involved. The narrative momentum shifted instantly back to the cobbles, where the absolute shock of the raid was paralyzing the residents gathered outside the police cordon. Aadi Alahan stood at the edge of the pavement, his chest heaving as he watched tech forensics officers wheeling plastic crates of seized computer hardware out into the pale morning light. Billy Mayhew and Paul Foreman had emerged from number 5, standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale as they realized the terrifying proximity of the danger that had hovered over their family. The crowd parted in a stunned, breathless silence as Ryan Connor was led out from the rear alleyway of the builder's yard by 2 uniform officers. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, and his eyes were downcast, refusing to meet the gaze of anyone on the street. Daisy Midgeley watched from the step of the rover's return, the damp cloth dropping from her hand onto the stone as the terrible suspicion she had carried all morning was vindicated in the most devastating way possible, proving that the digital parasite had indeed been living under their roof. However, the unexpected twist that would redefine the entire investigation unfolded minutes later back at the Weatherfield police station. In the high-security processing suite, Ryan Connor sat on a wooden bench, his head buried in his hands, weeping uncontrollably as DC Kit Green entered with the initial file of recovered chat logs. Under a barrage of intense questioning, Ryan's defensive armor shattered completely, revealing that he was not the mastermind behind the Weatherfield Web, but rather its most compromised victim. He confessed that the anonymous administrators had trapped him months ago through a sophisticated deepfake blackmail scheme involving his delivery accounts and private correspondence. They had forced him to act as a physical courier, dropshipping the secondary burner devices, including the one given to Summer Spellman, and maintaining the local servers under the explicit threat that his entire life would be systematically destroyed if he missed a single transmission window. Ryan looked up at Kit, his voice cracking with pure terror as he revealed that he had never once met the actual programmer behind the Archangel handle, describing a hierarchy of encrypted commands that proved the true architect was still operating entirely undetected within the community. Meanwhile, the data retrieved by Kit Green's emergency intervention began to pay immediate dividends in interview room 1. DS Lisa Swain returned to face Summer Spellman, but the atmosphere had shifted from adversarial interrogation to a collaborative race against time. Armed with the uncorrupted server logs, Swain was able to show Summer the definitive proof that the police now understood the extent of the duress she had been under. The digital trail confirmed that Summer's final messages to Theo Silverton were indeed a desperate attempt to abort his meeting with the blackmailers, completely clearing her of any murderous intent or complicity in his ambush. The profound relief that washed over Summer was visible. Her shoulders dropped for the first time in weeks, and she broke down into healing tears as Swain assured her that the custody clock had been halted, transforming her legal status from a prime suspect to the state's most critical protected witness. The episode moved toward its emotional climax as Billy and Paul were finally permitted into the station's secure consultation room to reunite with Summer. The embrace between the three of them was a powerful masterclass in domestic drama, stripped of all words, defined entirely by the fierce, protective grip of a family that had survived a descent into digital hell. As they held each other, Aadi Alahan sat outside in the waiting room with Dev, the young man finally allowing the heavy adrenaline of the past 3 days to evaporate, his father wrapping a proud, heavy arm around his shoulders in recognition of the bravery that had broken the encryption code. The final scene of the night returned to the now quiet builder's yard, where the police tape fluttered listlessly in the evening breeze under the yellow street lamps of Victoria Street. The camera slowly tracked away from the derelict building, panning across the dark windows of the street before settling on the silhouette of a figure standing completely still in the shadows of the Jinnel, watching the Alahan house with a cold, analytical detachment. The figure slowly lowered a smartphone, the screen reflecting a single, newly generated encryption key that signaled the web was already rebuilding its network elsewhere. The iconic, melancholy closing theme of Coronation Street began to play over the absolute silence of the perpetrator's retreat, leaving the audience in a state of intense suspense, fully aware that while Ryan and Summer had been liberated from their immediate cages, the true monster of Weatherfield remained hidden in plain sight among them.